In a clue book full of famous names, strange references, and glittering objects, Sonwai can feel like one of the most unexpected, almost easy to skip, almost too obscure to matter. But that is exactly why the name pulls at you. Because once you stop and ask who Sonwai was, you do not find some throwaway footnote. You find Verma Nequatewa, a Hopi master jeweler from Hoda Villa on Third Mesa, who learned under her uncle Charles Loloma and later signed her own work with the name Sonwai. And that changes everything, because Sonwai is not just a person. Sonwai is a doorway into one of the most refined and visually striking traditions in American jewelry. Gold, silver, coral, turquoise, lapis, sugilite, fossilized ivory, ironwood, ebony. Precise inlay fitted together so tightly it looks less like assembly and more like composition, almost like a landscape turned into architecture and then made small enough to wear. The more you study her work, the more it starts to feel like geography, memory, and ceremony compressed into form. So if Sonwai appears in a treasure context or anywhere near a list of remarkable objects, that mention is doing more than naming a jeweler. It is invoking a whole visual language, a whole world of color, material, lineage, and place. Verma Nequatewa grew up in Hoda Villa on the Hopi Reservation in Arizona, and that matters because her work never feels detached from where it comes from. Her designs are often tied to the environment around Third Mesa, to the stone walls, the changing skies, the surrounding land, and the ceremonial life of the village itself. Even when the jewelry is luxurious, even when it is made in rich gold and rare stones, it still feels rooted in earth rather than fashion. That is one of the reasons Sonwai is so compelling. A lot of jewelry wants to glitter first and mean something later. Sonwai's work feels different. It feels as if meaning came first, then discipline, then beauty. Not beauty as decoration. Beauty as an outcome of harmony, of balance, of knowing exactly what each stone should do, what each color should answer, and where each line should stop. To understand Sonwai, you have to understand the name beside hers in almost every biography. Charles Loloma. Loloma was her uncle, and he was not just respected, he was revolutionary. Sonwai apprenticed with him for years, learning techniques, stone selection, design judgment, and the kind of exacting standards that separate a fine piece from a masterwork. Later, her work was often described as distinct from her uncle's. Related to it, yes, but not trapped inside it. That distinction matters, because Sonwai is not interesting merely as the person who came after a legend. She is interesting because she absorbed that tradition and then spoke in her own voice. She did not stay a shadow. She became a signature, and that signature was literal. She began signing her work with the Hopi feminine word for beauty, Sonwai. That alone tells you a lot. This was not a random studio mark. It was identity, continuity, relationship. A statement about lineage but also about difference. Beauty, in this world, is not softness without structure. It is structure perfected until it becomes beauty. Look at the materials associated with her work, and you start to see how carefully she thought in layers. Coral against turquoise. Lapis against gold. Purple tones pressing into blue and red. Dark wood grounding the brighter stones. Fossilized ivory lending warmth and age. These are not casual combinations. They are orchestration. And in piece after piece, what stands out is control. The colors do not fight. They converse. That may be why her jewelry often feels almost architectural. Not in a cold way. In a sacred way. Shapes fitted like walls. Bands of color stacked like mesas. Surfaces cut into clean, deliberate planes. Sometimes the work looks like a horizon. Sometimes it looks like a shield. Sometimes it looks like a ceremonial object from a future that never abandoned the past. And that is where Sonwai becomes especially powerful as a story. Because her life sits at the intersection of inheritance and originality. She came from a lineage of makers. She learned inside one of the most influential studios in Native American jewelry. She mastered technique at a very high level. Then she continued, not as an imitator, but as an artist whose own work became desirable to private collectors and museums. So no, Sonwai is not random. She only looks random if you do not know the terrain. Once you do, the name starts to feel exactly right for a book or puzzle obsessed with extraordinary objects, because Sonwai's work belongs in that company. Not just because it is valuable. Plenty of things are valuable. Sonwai matters because her jewelry carries something deeper than price. It carries authorship, place, memory, material intelligence, cultural continuity. It turns stone into meaning. There is another detail that keeps pulling me back. She later published a book called Visions of Sonwai, a title that sounds less like a catalog and more like an interior world. Not just objects. Visions. That feels appropriate. Her work does not look accidental. It looks envisioned first, then patiently realized by hand. And maybe that is the real reason a name like Sonwai lodges in the mind of a treasure hunter. Because treasure is never only about possession. Real treasure is about recognition, about learning what you are actually looking at. A person skimming a list sees a name. A person paying attention sees a signal. Sonwai says beauty. Sonwai says Hopi. Sonwai says Third Mesa. Sonwai says Charles Loloma's studio, yes, but also a life beyond it. Sonwai says color arranged with ceremony and force. Sonwai says the object is not just an object. It is the visible end of a long chain of memory, teaching, place, and intention. That is why this episode matters. Because sometimes the smallest references crack open the biggest rooms. You start with a single unfamiliar name and end up in Hotavilla, on Third Mesa, in a studio overlooking the land, thinking about how artists translate homeland into form. You start with jewelry and end up thinking about identity, about inheritance, about how beauty can be disciplined rather than ornamental, about how a piece of gold and stone can hold the shape of a place. And once you have seen that, you cannot really go back to thinking of Sonwai as a side note. She becomes a key. Not the loudest key, not the easiest key, but one of those perfect hidden ones that tells you what kind of mind assembled the larger collection in the first place. A mind drawn not only to fame, but to mastery. Not only to obvious legends, but to makers whose work rewards the patient eye. So the next time that name appears, do not pass it by. Stop on it. Let it open. Because Sonwai is Verma Nequatewa, a Hopi jeweler from Hotavilla, an apprentice who became a master, an artist of gold, silver, stone, and exacting balance, a maker whose work carried her from Third Mesa into major collections and museum exhibitions while still remaining rooted in the land and culture that formed her. And in a world of treasure clues and symbolic objects, that kind of name is never there by accident. It is there because beauty leaves a trail, and Sonwai, fittingly, means beauty.